Now I taught the weeping willow how to cry.
That night is the dinner. And like I mentioned, it was a black tie affair. And it was mostly a Jewish audience because of John receiving the Shalom Peace Award. But there was all kind of politicians there. I believe the governor of Tennessee was there, and there was telegrams from Al Gore, from you name it. Everybody wanted to honor their favorite son, Johnny Cash. As I mentioned, it was a roast, and I'm not a drinker, but I belted down 3 scotches. I needed some bottled courage because I'm a nervous wreck. The lineup was such that you're sitting on this roast like you've probably seen on TV, where they actually gong people and get a hook and pull them off the stage, much like the Dean Martin roast and crazy stuff like that. Anyway, the roasters consisted of who's who in country music and me. The first roaster was a man named Sam Phillips. Well, anybody that knows the story of Johnny Cash and the story of country music and Sun Records knows that Sam Phillips was the founder of Sun Music. And I'm just going to jump back to our fishing trip when Johnny told me that Sam was going to be there. And I says, how come you left Sun Records, John? He said, well, Henry, it's a long story. He says, the biggest problem was Sam forgot how to count. I said, what do you mean? He said, my first royalty check before I walked the line was like $100 and some and some pennies. And so that's the main reason I left Sun Records. I wanted to go to some company that knew how to count. So, that's kind of a side. Anyway, Sam gets up there, and Sam was stoned out of his mind. I mean, he's rambling and rambling. Waylon stands up now. Waylon never had a tuxedo on in his life. He didn't have a tie on, but he had a tuxedo outfit on with no tie. And he gongs him and grabs the microphone off of Sam and boots him off stage. Kris Kristofferson grabs a microphone and he says, ladies and gentlemen, just think of this. He says, the birth of rock and roll started with that nut. He says, God does things in mysterious ways. Everybody starts laughing. Well, I'm the next roaster, and I am nervous out of my mind. So I get up, and I start off by reading a fictitious telegram that I had written on the airplane on the way out there. And it went something like this. Johnny Cash, Peabody Hotel, Memphis, Tennessee. Dear Johnny, your life is an inspiration to all who know you. I'm sorry, but pressing business keeps me out of the country. I hope to meet you soon at the bank in Switzerland. Your friend, Ferdinand Marcos. Now everybody's laughing. Now I said, to myself, they're either going to laugh at this next one or they're going to throw me the hell out. So I say, I'm glad you folks enjoyed that. I said, but I feel I can say this. I said, Johnny Cash is only a stage name, and they're listening. I said, only his close friends know what his real name is, and they're listening. I said, his real name is Murray Lipschitz. Everybody starts going nuts. I said, the only son of Ida and Izzy. And when the Cash family landed on Ellis Island, the first thing they did is they sold the Statue of Liberty for cash and changed their name. And this place went crazy. I knew I either laid an egg or went over good. It went over great. I said, life wasn't easy for young John. His father took him out into the woods, but he didn't take him out far enough, and he found his way back home. And they're laughing again. And I said, another thing, I said, anybody's ever been to Johnny's house knows that he's an avid antique collector. He's really got a beautiful collection of Louis XIV furniture. If he doesn't pay Louis by the 14th, he's got to give it back. And this place went nuts. So, I was very, very proud of myself because I was kind of a hit. Now I sit down. There was another roaster, and then the next roaster, who was it but Arthur Smith. Now, Arthur is a gentleman I told you about that wrote dueling banjos, guitar boogie, and he gets up. And a little prelude to what Arthur is going to say is, in 1956, Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings lived together. And there's nothing that these rock stars do today that those country boys didn't do back then. With the pills, the booze, the carousing, the womanizing, the ripping up hotel rooms, the breaking guitars and amplifiers, these country boys did it all. They blazed the trail. So with that as a background, Arthur gets up. And he says in his southern accent, "Ladies and gentlemen, I knew Johnny and Waylon." He says it was in a nervous period in their life. He says, "Johnny come to my house and my wife was sewing on a machine and a thread come loose." He says, "I'll be darned." He said, "Johnny threaded it, but it was still moving." And this place went crazy. And he said, "John and I was very good friends." He says, "Johnny was making a movie somewhere, and he says, 'Come on down to the set, Arthur, and after the day's shooting, we'll go to the hotel and get something to eat.' So he says, I get down there, and Johnny was making this movie, and he's playing as part of a Catholic priest in the movie, and we get in the car, and he's driving down the road. He says, must have still been in a nervous period," he says, "because Johnny's all over the road." So next thing I know, a policeman comes up beside us and rang the siren, and the blue light was flashing, and he pulled us over. And he looked down at John, who's driving the car, and he says, now John still had on a clerical collar from the shooting, and he says, the policeman says, "Why, Father, is there something wrong?" And John says, "No, son," he says, "I'm just tired, and we're going to the hotel and get something to eat and get some sleep." So the policeman, "Well," he says, "Okay, Father," he says, "just be careful." And as he's turning away, he says, "Wait a minute, Father," he says, "what's in that bottle on the seat between you and the other gentleman?" And Johnny says, "Oh, son," he says, "that's just holy water." He says, the policeman reached in and took this bottle and took the top off and tasted it. He says, "Wait a minute, Father," he says, "that's wine." Johnny looked at him. Praise the Lord, he did it again. And Arthur was the hit of that roast. So Arthur sits down. Now, we had other roasters. I mean, we had Rick Blackburn from CBS. We had John Schneider. We had Waylon Jennings, Jeannie C. Riley, June Carter, John Carter. I mean, they're all roasted, John. But one of the roasters that I really remember now is John J. Hooker. John J. gets up there and he says, "Folks," he says, "let me tell you something." He says, "I love politics and I love people." He said, "But when you run for statewide office and lose as many times as I've lost," he says, "you learn something." He says, "you work the other guy's crowd. And while you're here waiting for Johnny Cash to stand up and sing, and I'm talking, you got to listen to me." He said, "But folks, you don't get it." He says, "Here I am." He says, "I'm a grown man." He says, "Well, my belly is pregnant with not one, not two, but 3 acceptance speeches, undelivered." And this place went nuts. He says, "We're in the presence of the king." He says, "Johnny Cash thinks he was born in a manger." He said, "Not the manger, any manger, it doesn't matter." He says, "He thinks he's the king." He says, "Johnny," he says, "every time I turn on TV, all I do is I look at you and I hear you pick up a guitar and says, 'Hello, I'm Johnny Cash.' Well, who the hell you think I think you are?" He says, "You ain't Waylon Jennings." He says, "You got to be Johnny Cash." "Well, hell, I'm John J. Hooker." Anyway, and he looked over and he says, "John, I just want to salute you," he says, "because you are some man." So that's the kind of things I remember about this. They're highlight in my life, and to be there and to be able to honor my true friend and be in the presence of those people. And Johnny Cash and June Carter made you feel like you were part of their family. You were their adopted family.
Now I taught the weeping willow how to cry, and I showed the clouds how to cover up a clear blue sky. And the tears that I cried for that woman are gonna flow.